In the United Methodist Church, what has happened since the special called General Conference in February 2019, and what does it mean as we prepare for the next regular General Conference in May 2020? Great question. In this video, I provide an update on the disaffiliation legislation and allegations of improper voting. In the previous video, I gave an update on the traditional plan legislation, and you will find a link to it at the end of this video. In February, General Conference adopted a petition that outlined a process for churches to negotiate with their annual conference to disaffiliate from the denomination. The negotiation includes an exception to the trust clause so that the departing churches could take the property and assets entrusted to them. The original disaffiliation petition had been ruled unconstitutional by the United Methodist Judicial Council, but some of the wording had been changed. So to confirm whether the amended petition was valid, the Council of Bishops asked the Judicial Council to make a final determination on the approved legislation. At its April 2019 meeting, the Judicial Council reviewed the legislation and determined that it was valid when considered in combination with other parts of the Book of Discipline that require an annual conference's vote of approval before a local church can leave the denomination. In June, at the Mississippi Annual Conference session, 7 churches were approved to disaffiliate from the denomination under the new process. However, the Council of Bishops had a new question about whether this legislation went into effect immediately after General Conference, or would adhere to the policy for other legislation and go into effect in January 2020 in the U.S. jurisdictions and May 2021 in the Central Conferences. The preamble to the disaffiliation legislation said that it would go into effect immediately, but that was not in the wording of the legislation itself voted on by delegates. At its fall 2019 meeting, the Judicial Council affirmed that the disaffiliation petition was effective at the close of General Conference 2019. In March, the New York Times reported on questions about whether some of the people voting at the special General Conference had not been credentialed delegates. Some delegates known to have been absent due to visa issues were still listed on the attendance records, raising the question of who had attended and voted in those delegates' names. The Commission on General Conference took up the matter, hiring independent auditing and legal firms to investigate. In August, at the conclusion of the investigation, the Commission on General Conference determined there was sufficient evidence that 4 delegates were replaced with people who had not been elected by their annual conferences. In response to what the investigation uncovered, the Commission adopted new measures to implement at the next General Conference to better ensure that only elected delegates or their alternates receive badges and vote. Voting at General Conference is anonymous, so we don't know which way the 4 invalid votes were cast on any given ballot. But at the February General Conference, one action passed by a margin of less than 4 votes. The motion to substitute the minority report for the main legislation on the disaffiliation petition passed by a vote of 402 to 400. According to Robert's Rules of Order, when there are invalid votes on a ballot, and the number of invalid votes is greater than the deciding margin of votes, then that ballot is ruled null and void. What does that mean when the invalidated ballot was to change the wording of the legislation, not the final approval of the legislation? At the Commission on General Conference's request, the Council of Bishops asked the Judicial Council to determine what effect voiding the minority report substitution had on the validity of the disaffiliation petition. At its fall 2019 meeting, the Judicial Council determined it did not have sufficient information to make a decision and postponed consideration until its meeting in spring 2020, inviting the interested parties to submit briefs for consideration at that time. For now, the disaffiliation legislation remains in effect. What does all this mean for the United Methodist Church and General Conference delegates? Delegates at the next General Conference may notice some enhanced security measures in the processes to receive a badge and voting device and to access the voting areas. In the U.S., don't expect to see any more churches disaffiliate through the new process until the next season of annual conference sessions in May and June, and by then, General Conference delegates may have considered and approved modifications to this process, or even approved a new path for disaffiliation to replace this one. The question still to be resolved is whether the Judicial Council's review of the invalid votes will have any effect on the actions already taken under the disaffiliation legislation. There are links to related articles in the description below. You can also comment with your questions. As always, subscribe to this channel to get notices about my upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.